In the heart of Toronto's gay village, men began to vanish without a trace. Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Soroush Mahmoudi, Dean Lisowick, Selim Esen, Andrew Kinsman, and Kirushna Kanagaratnam. For years, their disappearances haunted the city, leaving families desperate for answers. Behind it all was Bruce McArthur, the friendly neighborhood landscaper, a man who smiled as he buried his victims beneath the flowers he planted. No one suspected that the kind Santa Claus at the mall was actually Toronto's most chilling predator. This is the story of deception, death, and the killer who hid in plain sight. It began quietly, with no one realizing the nightmare that was unfolding in Toronto's gay village. The first man to vanish was thought to have simply moved away or started fresh somewhere else. Then another disappeared and another. By the time people started connecting the dots, years had already passed. Friends and families hung missing posters on lampposts, their faces fading under rain and sunlight. Each man had been part of the same close-knit community, and each disappearance left behind a silence that grew heavier with time. At first, police believed the missing men had left voluntarily. Many of them were immigrants or had complicated personal lives, and investigators assumed they had just wanted to escape. But for those who knew them best, that explanation never made sense. These men had jobs, friends, and daily routines. They had plans, birthdays, dinners, appointments. Then, without any warning, they simply vanished. In the heart of the gay village, a sense of unease began to spread. People started looking over their shoulders, avoiding late-night walks, and warning one another to stay alert. The missing men seemed to share subtle similarities. Most were middle-aged, many had beards, and all were connected through dating apps or social spaces where one man, in particular, always seemed to appear. His name was Bruce McArthur. To anyone who met him, Bruce appeared harmless. He was friendly, even gentle. He worked as a landscaper, spending his days beautifying gardens across Toronto's quiet neighborhoods. During Christmas season, he worked as a mall Santa, smiling for photos with children and chatting with parents. He had a calm voice and a reassuring presence that made people trust him instantly. He was the last person anyone would suspect of having anything to do with such disappearances. Behind that gentle exterior, however, something much darker was taking shape. McArthur was known for his attention to detail, a trait that helped him in both his gardening and in hiding the truth. His landscaping jobs gave him access to private spaces, secluded backyards, garages, and storage areas that no one questioned. When one of his clients noticed an old metal barrel in their yard or large flower planters he insisted on keeping, they thought nothing of it. To them, it was just part of his work. But to those searching for the missing men, every day was a new kind of torment. Families begged for updates. Friends gathered at community meetings, sharing stories, timelines, and hopes that someone would come home. The police offered little progress, only more questions and growing frustration. Years passed this way. Missing posters replaced by new ones. The same neighborhood haunted by familiar faces that were no longer there. Through it all, Bruce McArthur continued his ordinary life, untouched and unsuspected. He laughed with co-workers, posted photos of his garden work, and moved freely through the same community he was silently destroying. To the world, he was just another man living a simple life. But in reality, he was hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. The truth was buried deep beneath Toronto's gardens, and no one yet realized that the man who planted flowers by day was burying his victims beneath them by night. Bruce McArthur lived a life that blended seamlessly into the background. To his friends and clients, he was dependable, polite, and professional. The kind of man who showed up on time, worked hard, and never caused trouble. He drove a red van filled with gardening tools, bags of soil, and pots of flowers. People would see him parked on quiet suburban streets, trimming hedges and chatting with homeowners. He seemed harmless, almost forgettable. But beneath that calm surface, a darker side of his life was taking shape. One that no one around him could have imagined. He was meticulous in everything he did. His work as a landscaper required precision, and he carried that same precision into his secret world. His clients often trusted him with their properties, giving him access to backyards, garages, and sheds. That privacy became his advantage. He learned which places were secluded, which yards were rarely visited, and where he could move without being noticed. Every garden he worked in offered an opportunity, a place where he could conceal what others would never think to search for. McArthur's reputation in the community was spotless. He had built a business on reliability, working for years without complaint. He was known to be kind to animals, good with plants, and friendly with his neighbors. He even took seasonal jobs as Santa Claus at the local mall, greeting families and posing for holiday photos. Parents saw him as gentle and trustworthy. Children smiled up at him, never knowing they were sitting on the lap of a man who carried a secret life filled with death. His victims were chosen carefully. They were men who lived on the edges of society, some struggling with identity, others far from home. Many were new to the city, looking for belonging in the gay village, where McArthur often spent his free time. He met them through dating apps and social networks, building trust slowly before luring them into isolation. Once he gained control, he left no trace. Phones went silent, apartments remained untouched. Lives simply disappeared. What made McArthur particularly dangerous was his ability to appear normal. He had no criminal record that suggested violence. Even when police questioned him years earlier about an assault, he managed to convince them it was a misunderstanding. They let him go. That encounter should have raised alarms, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. McArthur walked away free, learning from the experience how to hide even better. He documented everything, a digital archive of his crimes stored deep within his computer. The same man who posted garden photos online also kept secret folders filled with images of his victims. Each photograph told a story that no one else could see. He posed them, staged them, and saved them like trophies. It was proof of control, his way of reliving the moments he refused to let go of. Years went by as he continued to live two lives: the smiling gardener by day and the predator by night. The duality was chilling. Every time he planted flowers or trimmed a hedge, he worked above the very places he had buried his victims. People walked past those gardens, admiring their beauty, unaware of the horror that lay beneath. Bruce McArthur had mastered the art of disguise, a man who looked ordinary, but whose ordinary life hid extraordinary evil. The case began to unravel slowly, almost by accident. Years of disappearances had created a pattern too distinct to ignore, and detectives in Toronto's homicide unit started to revisit old files that had gone cold. There were too many similarities among the missing men: age, appearance, and connections to the same area. The gay village, once filled with laughter and nightlife, had become a place of anxiety and suspicion. People whispered about a predator, but no one had proof. Families pleaded for answers, and activists demanded the police take the cases more seriously. Detective teams began cross-referencing the victims' lives, searching for common ground. When they looked at phone records, dating apps, and last known locations, one name began to appear again and again: Bruce McArthur. At first, it seemed impossible. McArthur was known to the community, friendly and trusted. He had been interviewed years earlier when one of the men went missing, but at that time, police had found no reason to pursue him further. The lack of evidence had allowed him to continue, hidden in plain sight. The turning point came in 2017 when another man, linked to the same circle, vanished. His disappearance felt eerily familiar to investigators who had studied the earlier cases. They decided to dig deeper. This time they followed every digital footprint: text messages, online chats, meeting places. Surveillance cameras captured McArthur's red van near the missing man's last known location. It was the first solid lead they had in years. Police began to monitor McArthur's movements quietly. They set up surveillance, tracking where he went, who he met, and how he operated. Days turned into weeks of careful observation. Detectives knew they had to move slowly. One mistake could cause him to vanish or harm someone else. Meanwhile, they searched his background again: his work history, his clients, and the places he frequently visited. Everything appeared ordinary, but detectives could sense the darkness underneath. Then, one winter morning in January 2018, investigators noticed something that forced them to act immediately. McArthur had invited another man to his apartment. Officers, who had been following closely, feared that this might be another disappearance in progress. They moved in quickly, breaking down the door. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. A man restrained, terrified, but still alive. The officers had arrived just in time. The victim's survival became the key piece of evidence that tied McArthur directly to the crimes. As McArthur was taken into custody, police began to search his apartment. What they discovered was beyond comprehension. They found photographs, hundreds of them, documenting his victims in horrifying detail. Each image captured moments that revealed the full scope of his violence. Alongside the photos were personal items belonging to the missing men. It was clear they were not just victims of chance. They had been hunted. The rescue operation and the evidence inside McArthur's apartment exposed a serial killer who had operated undetected for nearly a decade. For detectives, it was both a victory and a nightmare. They had finally found their suspect. But what they were about to uncover next, buried in gardens and hidden beneath flowers, would show just how much horror had been hiding beneath the surface of Toronto's calm suburban life. After Bruce McArthur's arrest, detectives turned their attention to the places he had worked over the years. As a landscaper, he had access to dozens of private properties across Toronto, and police believed that some of those yards might hold evidence. Officers began methodically visiting every home and business linked to his landscaping company. Homeowners watched in disbelief as investigators arrived with shovels, cadaver dogs, and forensic tents. What had once been peaceful gardens filled with flowers were now being treated as potential crime scenes. The first major discovery came in a quiet neighborhood, behind a home where McArthur had often worked. Police found several large planters, each weighing far more than normal. Inside, buried beneath layers of soil and roots, were human remains. It was a shocking revelation. A killer who had hidden his victims in plain sight, beneath the very beauty he created. Each planter was carefully examined, and one by one, forensic teams uncovered more evidence linking the remains to the men who had gone missing. News of the discovery spread quickly through Toronto. Reporters crowded the streets, helicopters hovered overhead, and the entire city seemed frozen in disbelief. How could someone so ordinary, so trusted, commit crimes so monstrous without anyone noticing? The planters became symbols of the horror that McArthur had concealed. Neighbors who had once waved to him now looked out their windows, afraid to imagine what else might be hidden beneath the soil. Police didn't stop there. They expanded their search to every property McArthur had worked on in the past decade. More remains were found, scattered across multiple locations. Each discovery brought new grief to families who had spent years hoping their loved ones were still alive. The truth was now undeniable. Bruce McArthur had used his landscaping business as a cover, turning gardens into graves. Forensic experts worked around the clock using DNA testing to identify each victim. The process was slow and painful. Every match confirmed what investigators feared, that the list of victims was longer than anyone had expected. Evidence suggested that McArthur had carefully chosen his burial sites, often returning to maintain them so no one would suspect a thing. The flowers he planted above the remains continued to bloom, hiding the evidence beneath layers of life and color. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized how calculated his actions had been. He had used his knowledge of soil, plant growth, and landscape design to cover his crimes perfectly. Each grave was hidden beneath beauty, and every garden told a story of deception. It was a disturbing mix of control and concealment. A man who found satisfaction in disguising death as art. The discovery of the planters marked a turning point in the investigation. The evidence was overwhelming, and the city's grief turned into outrage. The community that had once been ignored by police demanded accountability, not just for the victims, but for the years of missed warnings. By the time the last planter was unearthed, Toronto was no longer the same city. The gardens that had once symbolized peace and life were now reminders of how evil can hide in the most ordinary places, cared for by a man who had used beauty itself to bury the truth. When Bruce McArthur finally stood before the court, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators had built a case that left no room for doubt. The photographs found on his computer, the remains recovered from the planters, and the testimony of the man rescued from his apartment painted a portrait of calculated cruelty. For years, he had hidden behind his friendly smile, convincing everyone he was harmless, while secretly preying on vulnerable men. Now the mask had been ripped away, revealing the darkness he had concealed for nearly a decade. The courtroom was filled with grief and disbelief. Families of the victims sat in silence, clutching photos of their loved ones, as prosecutors described how McArthur had targeted, manipulated, and murdered them. Each name read aloud echoed through the chamber like a reminder of all that had been lost. The details were unbearable. How he had lured men with trust, how he had documented their final moments, and how he had hidden their bodies under the very flowers he planted. For many, it felt less like a trial, and more like the unearthing of a nightmare that had haunted Toronto for years. McArthur showed little emotion. He listened, eyes forward, rarely reacting as the evidence was presented. His calmness unsettled everyone in the room. There was no sign of remorse, no attempt to explain or justify his actions. It was as if he had detached himself entirely from the horror he had caused. The judge and jury, however, needed no explanation. The facts spoke for themselves. After months of testimony and analysis, Bruce McArthur was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. His sentence was life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. A punishment that, for many, still felt far too small for the devastation he had caused. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered to mourn. Memorials appeared across Toronto's gay village. Flowers, candles, and photographs lined the streets where the victims had once walked. People hugged, cried, and shared memories, united by pain and resilience. For years, the disappearances had been brushed aside or misunderstood, and now the truth was finally visible to the entire nation. McArthur's crimes had not only stolen lives but shaken the trust of an entire community that had long fought to be heard. Even after the verdict, questions lingered. How had he gone undetected for so long? How had someone so ordinary managed to deceive so many? Police departments across Canada reviewed their procedures, acknowledging failures and pledging to do better for future investigations. The case became a dark lesson in how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Behind politeness, behind a job, behind a smile. In the years that followed, the memory of Bruce McArthur's crimes remained a scar on Toronto's history. His name became synonymous with betrayal and horror, a reminder that monsters do not always look like villains. Sometimes they look like neighbors, co-workers, or friends. The gardens he once tended were eventually replanted. The soil turned and renewed. But beneath the flowers, the shadows of his crimes still lingered. The story of Bruce McArthur was not only about the victims he took, but also about a city that learned too late that even the most ordinary life can conceal extraordinary darkness. The story of Bruce McArthur reminds us how evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. For years, he lived among his victims, smiling, working, and blending into the rhythm of everyday life, until the truth finally came to light. His crimes left deep scars on Toronto's gay village and changed how a nation views trust, safety, and justice. Every victim's name deserves to be remembered, not as a headline, but as a life stolen too soon. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Justice is only remembered when we keep the stories alive.